Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are based. I can see that the list of participants is going up, so we might wait another 10-20 seconds before we dig into the content. Thanks. So thank you all for joining us today to discuss the forced labor situation in the production of cotton in Turkmenistan, and also discuss what we can do at both regional and global levels to end this practice. The webinar is hosted by the Cotton Campaign. We are a global coalition united to end forced labor in cotton production in Central Asia. My name is Raluca Dumitrescu, and I am the coordinator of the Cotton Campaign. And before we dive into the content, let me note first a few housekeeping rules. So first of all, the webinar will be recorded. The recording will be published on the Cotton Campaign website. We will also circulate the recording and the PowerPoint presentation to everyone who registered for this webinar. We are providing simultaneous interpretation throughout the event. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will find the white globe title interpretation. Please go there to select your preferred language, either English or Russian. Our interpreter will take a break for a few minutes, around 40 minutes into the event, during a portion where the panelists will be speaking English. So please, if there are people in the audience who need translation into Russian, please let us know in the chat and we will provide a summary of what is being presented in writing. For questions, please use the Q&A section in Zoom. Of course, you are also welcome to post your questions in the regular chat. And after the presentation is finished, I think we'll have about 20-30 minutes to allocate for questions. This being said, we are looking forward to a very lively discussion. We're really happy to have on the line a wide range of stakeholders, including policymakers from the EU and the US, representatives of enforcement agencies, international organizations, as well as human rights activists. Okay, so this being said, let me start by showing you the agenda for today. So first, I will give you a brief introduction on what our work at the Cotton Campaign is and what our strategy is to end state-imposed forced labor in Turkmenistan. Then we will hear from our partners, Turkmen.News and the Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights, the two leading Turkmen NGOs that today launched their joint report about the 2021 cotton harvest in Turkmenistan. Please note, both of them are forced to work from exile, given the repressive environment in Turkmenistan, where the government has taken harsh action until now against human rights activists and pretty much against anyone who speaks out against abuses in the cotton sector and beyond. And just to give you a brief example showing the situation in the country, recently Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights reported on a case on their website of a Turkmen man convicted to 6 years in prison for having spoken to a journalist about human rights violations in the country. So Turkmen.News, here the second person you'll hear speaking, Turkmen.News is based in the Netherlands, and they are a long-time partner of the Cotton Campaign. They have monitored forced labor in cotton production in Turkmenistan for 9 years now. And the Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights is based in Austria, and they are a leading voice on human rights issues in Turkmenistan. They published first-hand monitoring of a range of rights issues on their website called Chronicles of Turkmenistan. And we will share the links with you in the chat. Then following interventions from our Turkmen partners, we will hear from Allison Gill. She's the Forced Labor Program Director at Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, or briefly GLJ-ILRF, which is the organization hosting and coordinating the cotton campaign. And she will present supply chain research findings showing that Turkmen cotton enters the global supply chains and is used in the production of our clothes and our home textiles, in particular bed linens and towels. And finally, we will turn to our colleague Rocío Domingo Ramos from Anti-Slavery International, who will talk about what legislative developments we need to be seeing soon to ensure that the cotton supply chains are free of forced labor. And she will focus specifically on the need for robust import control mechanisms to block Turkmen cotton products from entering global markets, as well as focus on the need for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation to require companies to map their supply chains and exclude cotton made in Turkmenistan. So now, like I said, let me give you a brief introduction on the cotton campaign so that I can help you place this webinar and our work in the wider landscape of international human rights and corporate accountability work. So the first thing I want to share with you, we are a global coalition. We're working to end forced labor and promote decent work for cotton workers in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. We bring together human rights NGOs, independent trade unions, brand associations, responsible investors, and academics. We are all united to end forced labor in cotton production. Here on this slide, you can see some of the logos of our coalition members. And now, since cotton is a global commodity, our strategy to pressure the government of Turkmenistan to end forced labor is also a global strategy. So we are targeting global brands and retailers, governments, regional organizations, multi-stakeholder initiatives, and international organizations. And we are calling for full transparency and traceability of the global cotton supply chains. And to this end, I want to mention that our cotton campaign members are also deeply engaged in the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition, which in the last 2 years has done tremendously successful work to raise awareness of forced labor in cotton supply chains. So I mentioned that we're pursuing a global strategy, and you're probably wondering what exactly does that mean? So here on this slide, you can see listed our main directions of action. So first of all, we have independent reporting. The findings of independent monitoring of the cotton harvest in Turkmenistan are what drives our advocacy and campaigning. Our Turkmen NGO partners, whom you'll hear from today and I introduced earlier, work with a group of brave Turkmen human rights activists who provide first-hand reports of the forced labor conditions in the cotton fields. And these activists run great risks for arrest and torture for doing this work, because as I mentioned earlier, Turkmenistan is deeply authoritarian. It's resisting reforms to the cotton industry and has taken harsh actions against those who report on abuses in this sector. And here on the left side of the slide, you can see pictures from the harvest reports that our Turkmen partners issued throughout the years. And these pictures have been modified to protect the identity of the cotton pickers and monitors. And also, again, for safety reasons, I want to mention, it's really crucial that the information that monitors collect on the ground in the fields is stored and is provided in a secured manner. And to achieve this, the Turkmen NGOs that are our partners, they're doing great work to train the independent monitors on how to identify forced labor, how to gather information, and they're working to ensure a safe channel for communications with them. Then moving towards the middle of the slide, we campaign and conduct international advocacy to increase the pressure on the government of Turkmenistan to reform its forced labor system. And here you can see a picture of a cotton campaign protest at the UN in New York a few years back. Our colleagues were calling on the Turkmen government to end forced labor and release activist Gaspar Matalaev, who was arrested in October 2016 for monitoring and reporting on the use of forced adult and child labor in Turkmenistan. Gaspar was tortured and he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. Our advocacy also focuses on engaging governments to use international fora and to persuade the Turkmen government, first of all, to admit the forced labor situation, and second, to take steps to address it. And here you can see a picture of the US State Department Trafficking in Persons report, which we are happy to report. Since 2015, as a result of our advocacy, among others, it has maintained Turkmenistan at tier 3, which is the lowest ranking. And finally, on the right side of the slide, you can see a critical aspect of our strategy is to increase the economic pressure on the government of Turkmenistan by limiting access of Turkmen cotton goods to international markets. And we do this through a wide range of tactics. First, we host the Turkmen Cotton Pledge. This is a public commitment. By now, it's been signed by over 140 companies, and they all committed to not use Turkmen cotton in their products as long as it's being produced with forced labor. We also advocate for the introduction of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, and we'll talk about this later during the webinar, a legislation to require companies to map and disclose their suppliers throughout their entire supply chains, and also eliminate cotton from Turkmenistan to make sure that their supply chains are free of forced labor. And finally, we conduct supply chain research to trace Turkmen cotton, and we are using our findings to alert authorities. We know that Turkmenistan exports different types of cotton products, including raw cotton, cotton yarn, cotton fabric, as well as finished goods made of cotton, such as towels and other home textiles. And we engage with policymakers and customs authorities to advocate for a stronger enforcement of the existing forced labor import bans in the US and Canada. And again, we'll be discussing this a bit later in the webinar, as well as we call for the introduction of import control measures against forced labor products in other jurisdictions. And here in the right side of the slide, I added a print shot of the submission we did as the cotton campaign a few weeks ago to the European Commission, calling for the introduction of a broader mechanism to prevent goods made with forced labor from entering the EU. And I think it's important here to mention that similar tactics and similar actions driven by civil society and involving brands and governments have proven successful in ending state-imposed forced labor in Uzbekistan. And I know that many of you attending the webinar today are familiar with our work in Uzbekistan. And you know that already for a few years now, the Uzbek government has implemented reforms to end forced labor and to change its cotton sector. And in Uzbekistan, independent monitoring of the harvest of last year's harvest, so in 2021, has shown that the government is no longer using state-imposed forced labor. And as a result, we as the cotton campaign lifted the Uzbek Cotton Pledge, which is a similar public tool to boycott cotton from Uzbekistan, just as we have the Cotton Pledge for Turkmenistan. And we are now working with brands to begin a program for responsible sourcing from Uzbekistan to ensure that brands can begin sourcing in a manner that protects labor rights. So all of this is to say that success is possible, and we are calling on all of you, we as the Cotton Campaign are calling on all of you present here on this webinar to join our efforts to end forced labor in Turkmenistan by directly engaging with the Turkmen government, by using legislative tools to eliminate forced labor from global supply chains, and in the end, really using any opportunity you have in international fora to advance our joint work on ending forced labor. So this is the report that our Turkmen partners have launched today. We'll post the link to the report in the chat, and you can also find it in the last slide of this presentation, which will be circulating after the webinar. So here on the slide, you can see the key areas that the report covers. Important to mention, on today's webinar, we will cover only the areas focused on cotton, which make up the core of the report. However, please note that in this report, our partners also expose the forced labor situation in the production of silk, and we encourage you to read it. And before giving the floor to the next speaker, I want to mention that in addition to reports by independent monitors, the forced labor findings presented in this report are also based on information from Turkmen people on the ground, including farmers or people forced to pick cotton or linked in some other way to the production of cotton in Turkmenistan. So this being said, I'm now giving the floor to my colleague Ruslan Myatiev, Director of Turkmen.News, to present the forced labor findings. Ruslan, please go ahead and let me know when to switch the slides for you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, America. Good afternoon, Europe. It's a great pleasure that there's such a great number of participants listening to this webinar. This means to us that Turkmenistan has not been forgotten, and the issue of forced labor is a priority, if I'm allowed to say so. As Raluca introduced already, my name is Ruslan Myatiev. I'm the founder and editor of Turkmen.News. We report about the news that are happening in Turkmenistan and that do not get reflected in the local media. We talk about the bad economic situation of the country, all the news related to the people, the things happening at work, at school, and elsewhere, as well as covering political events, changes, and other topics. One of the key spheres of our work is indeed forced labor monitoring. We do it since 2013. And I think I can say that we proudly do this work despite all of the challenges which Raluca mentioned already, despite the significant risk to local sources and reporters, despite the government's attempts to block the internet to prevent uncontrolled flow of information. In 2021, we, with partners from the Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights, managed to obtain solid evidence of public sector workers, including teachers, doctors, bank and telecom employees, being sent to pick cotton against their will and under the threat of dismissal. All of the findings are based on audio-visual materials sent to us by monitors and reporters. They're based on personal accounts of people who were forced to pick cotton and the accounts of farmers who were forced to produce cotton and sell it to the state at fixed prices. Together with the cotton campaign, we compiled the findings in this report we're about to share today. This report is based around several key statements, and I'll throw these statements today on the table. If you have any questions, I can elaborate, go deeper into them at the end of this webinar. Well, the first one is nothing in 2021 was different from all of the previous years in terms of the forced labor practices in Turkmenistan. In fact, in some areas, the situation has gotten even worse. If you remember, last year we reported that doctors, for example, in several regions of the country were freed from cotton picking simply because they were barely handling the COVID disaster. And by the way, Turkmenistan until today is officially COVID-free, despite documented evidence of the contrary, despite dozens of proven cases of disease and even death, even among foreign diplomats stationed in Ashgabat. So in 2021, COVID naturally was not gone, but the doctors were sent to pick cotton from September until almost the end of November, though by that time, there was nothing left to pick already. In most of the cases, and that is the second statement, public sector workers were asked to find a replacement cotton picker or pay money so that the hospital or polyclinic management could find replacements themselves. Because of COVID including, and the government's mishandling the situation around it, very few people expressed willingness to travel in overcrowded buses to the cotton fields, even with the incentive to get paid for it. The third key finding of last year's harvest is a large number of children that picked cotton. As you may know, if you follow the news from Turkmenistan, for several years in a row, the country is experiencing severe economic crisis and a shortage of basic staples. Families are given half a liter of cottonseed oil per month, or 1 chicken leg per month, or just a dozen of eggs, or half a kilo of sugar, all per family per month. We found that poverty was the primary driving force of child labor, as well as the government-orchestrated forced labor system. Families sent their children so that they either could earn some money and therefore buy food, or they were asked to replace their parents who were public sector workers. When we say children, we mean teenagers between the ages of 12 to 17. We found that in regions like Dashoguz, which is the north of Turkmenistan, children would offer themselves as pickers early in the morning at pickup points for adult pickers, and no one from the government prevented them from boarding buses and traveling to the fields. That's a normal practice when somebody from the Hakimlik, that is the city hall or the governor's office, let's say, that somebody is controlling this entire process, how many people came from this department or that school or this hospital. All of the people, their last names are being put down in the list, and then all that information, all those lists of cotton pickers from particular organizations, state organizations, are then taken to the city hall and then reported to Ashgabat. Often children picked cotton alongside their parents simply because there was no one available to babysit a child. You know, a mother could not leave, for example, her child or even her children alone at home, so she would take them with. And by earning some money, we're talking about approximately $1.5 American per picking day. By the way, that is how much civil servants had to pay per day as well. From over 3 months that civil servants had to pick cotton, they would spend more than their monthly wage, which in Turkmenistan is different depending on the region where you live and depending on the enterprise where you work. But I can tell you that, for example, a school teacher with normal teaching hours earns somewhere around $100 per month. Sometimes children missed schools to support their families by picking cotton. Sometimes they picked for up to 1.5 months, which is roughly half of the harvest. In October, during a 10-day fall break, the number of children in the cotton fields grew significantly because, as I said, the situation with the economy in the country is very bad. Unemployment is huge, especially in the rural areas like Dashoguz, Lebap, and Mari. So even this amount of money, $1.5 American per day, was significant support for families that lacked money. Last but definitely not least is the situation with the farmers and the forced labor system in other areas, in areas other than cotton. And for this, I would like to give floor to my colleague, Farid Tukhbatullin. If you have any questions for me, I'll happily answer them at the end of all presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan, for the information provided. And just for those of you watching the presentation, please know that we included in here additional information about the COVID-19 situation in Turkmenistan. And Turkmen.News has also done a documentary about the situation in the country following the government policies or lack of policies on this issue ever since 2019. And again, we're happy to share with you the link of the documentary, and it's also mentioned at the end of the presentation, which is the PowerPoint that will circulate to you after the webinar. So before giving the floor to our colleague Farid, I just want to thank Ruslan for the information provided. And I want to emphasize that, from a supply chain perspective, and we'll address this a bit later in the discussion, for us, it's really crucial that stakeholders understand that the forced labor system in Turkmenistan is government controlled from the top down. And this means that it is impossible for brands to prevent or to remediate forced labor in the harvest of cotton, since we're talking about systematic forced labor. And what does this mean? It means that actually the only way for brands to make sure that their supply chains are free of forced labor cotton coming from Turkmenistan is to fully eliminate it from the supply chains. And we're moving forward now. I'll quickly give the floor to our colleague Farid Tukhbatullin, leading the Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights, who will speak on the situation of farmers in Turkmenistan. Thanks.
Hello. And I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak. Ruslan mentioned it for the most part, but what we do is slightly different. We work on monitoring the situation of tenants, or we may say farmers, in Turkmenistan. Our organization was registered in Austria in 2004, and our website has been working since 2006. We've been monitoring different human rights areas. We're preparing various reports on women's rights, children's rights, various socio-cultural rights, and so on. In the last 2 years, together with our colleagues, we've also been working on the cotton situation in Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan still has central planning, central government, like back in the Soviet Union, and it's everywhere, including in farming and agriculture. That means that the government decides how much cotton, how much wheat to plant, to harvest, and then the president issues orders when to start sowing, when to start harvesting, and so on. There is no business autonomy in this area, and people pretty much work in what used to be collective farms in the Soviet Union, even though now they're called farmers associations. And they're always intimidated. They're always told that if they don't obey, land is going to be taken away from them and they will have no means of subsistence. That's why they're forced on those 3 or 4 hectares that they have to plant what they're told. And local authorities don't always give them what they're supposed to give them, like fertilizers, seeds, and equipment. So many people actually have to find money and pay for equipment themselves. For example, if you get a cotton picker machine, then you have to pay your own fuel, your own lubricants, and so on. And those people that they send to you from the city to supposedly help, that means that you need to give them accommodation, food, and so on. And this is something that those tenant farmers have to do. So any kind of incentive, if I even may call it an incentive, their only incentive is to keep their land. But they have no incentives to make money. And it started with Niyazov, the president, who didn't want the country to have any rich people. And this system makes everyone equal, and any business person, and it's not even in agriculture, any business person cannot really get rich. And last year, for example, we made some calculation. A family, it's not just one person who's doing cotton production. One family made 900 manats. That's $45. And we know that the minimal wage in Turkmenistan is 1,050 manats. So they made less than minimal wage. And of course, it's also a little bit unclear where this minimal wage comes from, because there is no such thing is like basic living standard in Turkmenistan. So we don't know how officials decide how much money you actually need to live in Turkmenistan. But according to our monitoring systems, we see that, of course, those who suffer the most are people in rural areas, because they don't have a lot of sources of income and they have to do whatever they're told. Like I already said, for example, pay out of their pockets to buy fertilizers. And the situation, for example, is difficult not only because you have to pay, but also because there's less fertilizers with every year. We have a situation with a carbamide plant that was built by the Belarusians, and each year the production keeps going down. And basically what happens is that they built a plant, but they didn't really do it properly. It's a big plant that can really produce a lot, but unfortunately, there's just not enough raw materials to process at this plant. And of course, the president is trying to say that all the plants are supposed to work full speed, but the problem is that, again, there's no raw materials. And what it means is that farmers do not have fertilizers, and they have to smuggle it, for example, from Uzbekistan, or use other illegal ways to obtain it. And of course, it's not very good for either the Turkmen economy or the Turkmen agriculture. And another thing that is mentioned in our report is that because of extreme weather conditions last year, the lack of water and drought, this is something that made growing cotton very difficult. And of course, the yields are very low, but every time reports are sent up, it says it's all done, the plan is met, and the authorities are applauding themselves, but farmers don't get any benefit from that. They still stay in poverty. And even, for example, they were allowed to grow something else, at least on the 10% of the land that they have, they would be happy, because that would be an extra source of income for them. But the authorities do not want to deal with that. They don't want to allow people to make any money. And this is a big problem. It's a big problem for farmers, for people who actually grow crops, and that's why we're monitoring this situation constantly. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer any questions.
Thank you, Farid, for your presentation. I think it's clear that in Turkmenistan, cotton production is under full control by the government, and the state forces farmers to meet official production quotas under threat of penalty. Now we will hear from our colleague Allison Gill, who is the Forced Labor Program Director at GLJ-ILRF, which is the organization hosting and coordinating the cotton campaign. And Allison will present findings from supply chain research that show how forced labor Turkmen cotton enters the global supply chains. Allison, the floor is yours, and let me know when to switch the slides.
Thank you, Raluca, and I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. In particular, warm thank you and congratulations to Farid and to Ruslan and to their networks for the really fundamental and vital work that they do monitoring the cotton supply chain at very great risk. So although Turkmenistan remains closed to independent scrutiny, including monitoring by international bodies, and is often seen as somewhat remote or removed from global systems, it remains linked to the world through global trade, including of cotton and cotton products, such as yarn, fabric, and finished goods. These goods make their way into global supply chains and into the hands of consumers in the United Kingdom, in EU countries, and into the US. This is particularly important when we think about how to end complicity with state-imposed forced labor, and also to help us understand where we might bring our leverage to bear on the government of Turkmenistan to end these abuses. So on this slide, you'll see a graphic which you will also find in the report and can look at in more detail there. But it shows the trade flows in terms of dollar value of cotton products imported to various countries from Turkmenistan. It does not show specific trade routes, as many goods are transshipped through third countries, sometimes for additional value-added processing. So this graphic shows countries that imported cotton and cotton goods from Turkmenistan in 2020 with a trade value of over $100,000. Imports with a trade value of less than $100,000 were reported by an additional 21 countries. Many of the countries that imported goods from Turkmenistan are producer countries that in turn export value-added or finished goods to suppliers and brands that make their way into global supply chains and into global markets. I want to highlight 3 examples on this slide that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in the next. So the first is Turkey. Turkey is the primary manufacturer of garments and textiles using Turkmen cotton, importing by far the largest volume and dollar value of Turkmen cotton products. Turkey is the 3rd largest textiles supplier to the European Union, which puts EU consumers at heightened risk of purchasing goods made with forced labor. And if you know a little bit about cotton supply chains, you know that cotton can be difficult to trace because it can be amalgamated at the spinning level or at the mill level with cotton from other countries. And there are only now emerging systems to trace cotton goods throughout the supply chain. And until recently, many brands did not look very far below tier 1, if at all below tier 1, in terms of understanding the origins of their cotton or their cotton inputs. The next example I just wanted to touch on is Portugal. Portugal is the largest importer of Turkmen cotton products among several other countries in the European Union that produces finished goods, many of which are for sale within the EU. I also want to note the US and Canada. Finished goods produced in Turkmenistan, you can go back, Raluca, just briefly, and then we'll get to the next. Finished goods produced in Turkmenistan, including towels, bed linens, and fabric by the yard, continued to be sold in the US and Canada, despite a withhold release order or a customs import prohibition, which has been in place in the US since 2018. Now you can go to the next, it'd be great. Thanks. So this will give us a little bit more detail on imports of Turkmen finished goods into the US. Here we have information that highlights the retailers Kmart and Overstock, although I want to note that these are just examples, and we have found products retailing on other e-commerce sites in the US, as well as some fabric available wholesale. These screenshots of goods for sale in the United States were taken just this month, and links to the links to these products are included, I think, in the last informational slide that we'll have for you. And they showed the text on the retailers' pages that the products are made with cotton from Turkmenistan, showing Turkmenistan as the country of origin. And I want to highlight here that this is an issue that we've been tracking ever since the US withhold release order or import prohibition has been in place. And we've called attention in op-eds and in direct advocacy engagement to the problem of e-commerce sites failing to do due diligence on their suppliers and selling products that are otherwise banned from import into the US for sale to US consumers. And to this end, we wrote letters to Overstock and another retailer, Wayfair, a year ago, highlighting products that they were selling made from produced entirely in Turkmenistan. And those products were briefly taken down, but they're now for sale again. This points to the need for stronger enforcement of the existing import prohibition, as well as strengthened due diligence requirements and accountability measures, including penalties on companies that knowingly and willfully violate laws against forced labor. You can go to the next slide, please. And here we can take a similar look at Canada. We have also tracked a number of goods that are for sale in Canada, many of which reach US ports and are then sent on to Canada for sale. And we think this is probably just the tip of the iceberg of what we can see. There may be many more shipments, but because of obfuscations in trade data in entering Canadian and US supply chains, we can't always track as many as we would like. Here I will note that Canada has committed to banning imports of goods produced with forced labor anywhere in the world under the US-Canada-Mexico agreement. It has implemented this requirement by amending its customs tariff in 2020 and has imposed additional sanctions regarding goods originating in Xinjiang that are tainted with Uyghur forced labor. And there are 2 pending bills that will have further implications for imports potentially tainted with forced labor if they are passed. However, here I want to emphasize real gaps in enforcement, with few shipments apparently stopped. Again, there is not full public reporting on this, but a report that we saw in May lists only 1 shipment that had been known to be stopped as of May, a shipment from China that was deemed to have been containing goods produced with forced labor. And at a minimum, I also want to note that using US ports to transship goods produced with forced labor to Canada violates certainly the spirit, if not the text, of the US import prohibition. And I would also note that the products that we are seeing for sale, some of the products that we're seeing for sale in Canada are shipped from Dubai through the US by a company registered in Pakistan, which has subsidiaries in Ashgabat in Turkmenistan and Dubai. This is just a little hint at how intricate the industry is and highlights the need for transparency in trade and shipping data, as well as for coordination between countries in enforcing forced labor provisions. Next slide, please, Raluca. Finally, I want to wrap with more detail on the Portugal example, which is importing Turkmen cotton, yarn, and fabric to suppliers that are producing finished goods for sale, many of which are for sale within the EU. While we know the value of the imports from Turkmenistan, we don't know to which suppliers the cotton, yarn, and fabric are going to because of lack of transparency in shipping and import data. The open apparel registry list we've given as an example to show that all the brands all these brands would need to conduct enhanced due diligence to ensure their suppliers don't use or work with Turkmen cotton. And there are really robust recommendations produced by NGOs, trade unions, and others on what is required for brands to end relationships with suppliers that are potentially using goods tainted with forced labor. And I want to caveat here that the open apparel registry list is not exhaustive because not all brands publish their list of suppliers. And here, I think it's really important to note that this underscores the need for a strong border mechanism as part of the EU's forced labor instrument. And you'll hear more about this from my colleague Rocío coming up. Happy to answer any questions about this. And I know we have some enforcement officials participating today. So we're really grateful to have you here and hope that we can be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Allison. The case studies you presented, I think they show very clearly that we're dealing with different scenarios when it comes to how forced labor Turkmen cotton enters global markets. And now we'll hear from Rocío Domingo Ramos, who is a Business and Human Rights Policy and Research Officer at Anti-Slavery International, on the need for robust legislation to address precisely those scenarios that Allison noted earlier.
Thank you, Raluca. Can you hear me? Yeah, right? Great. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you as well to Farid, Ruslan, my colleagues, Allison and Raluca. I'm really glad to be here talking today about policy avenues to address forced labor in Turkmenistan's cotton sector, because from what we have seen in many cases, these human rights abuses that Ruslan and Farid were talking about do not get the attention that they deserve. So it is great to have the time and the space today to do so. So if you can move to the next slide, Raluca. I'll start talking about what is it that we can do or that it's needed in order to remove forced labor Turkmen cotton from global supply chains. And what we know, though, is that these efforts are needed not just from the company side, but we also need governments to regulate the situation and to implement policy changes for companies to have to comply with. So we also know as well that no legislative instrument on its own will solve this issue. There's no silver bullet here. And what we need is a smart mix of different measures tackling the root causes of this system. So today I'm going to focus on two elements in particular, as Raluca was explaining. So I'm going to be talking about why we need very strong mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, and also why we need effective control mechanisms that ban the imports of forced labor products across jurisdictions. Then I also briefly wanted to mention that we have seen that as a result of very strong and ongoing advocacy at both national and international levels, we are witnessing the introduction of legislative proposals and legislation on both MHR-EDD and import controls around the world. So for example, when it comes to import controls, we've got the US, Mexico, Canada region, and together with an upcoming proposal for legislation from the EU. Then in terms of MHR-EDD, there are many European countries that have introduced or are working to introduce such legislation, such as France, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on. And then we also have legislation and proposals coming from elsewhere, including Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, for example. Some of these initiatives are still at early stages, and the implementation of existing forced labor import bans and MHR-EDD laws still require a little refinement to ensure that they are fully effective. So before I move on to some recommendations on how to do that, I'd like to briefly talk about what are the key components of these two policy instruments that I'm talking about. So Raluca, if you can move to the next slide. So first, when we talk about MHR-EDD, what is it that we talk about? If effectively designed and implemented, an MHR-EDD framework would require companies to undertake due diligence to first identify, assess, prevent, mitigate, and remedy human rights and environmental risks and impacts across their entire value chain. This is in line with both the UNGPs, so the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. Then again, if effectively designed and implemented, an MHR-EDD law would hold companies accountable when they cause harms and also when they breach the due diligence standard of conduct. And then lastly, if effectively designed, this standard of conduct should require companies to undertake meaningful stakeholder consultation, focus efforts on the prevention of adverse impacts, and this can include examining the impact of their business models and strategies with suppliers, sub-suppliers, and so on. With the case of Turkmenistan in particular, this is very relevant because, as Raluca was mentioning earlier, it would require companies to map and publicly disclose their subsidiaries, their suppliers, their sub-suppliers, and all business partners across their value chain in order to be able to identify where the raw material is coming from and therefore identify where forced labor risks are. Then moving on to import controls, this should be designed to withhold the release of goods made or transported either in whole or in part with forced labor, which would allow custom authorities to stop any forced labor goods entering their markets. And these actions should be taken whenever there's a reasonable suspicion or assumption that there's been use of forced labor in any products. So companies would then have to prove two things. So first, prove that goods imported are forced labor free, and also they would have to take action in order to remedy the situation on the ground. However, what happens with these two elements in the context of Turkmenistan? First, I'd like to be clear that when I say proving that goods are forced labor free, it doesn't mean that goods are not made with forced labor in Turkmenistan, because it's just not, there's no way to do that. So what you need to prove is that your goods are free from any cotton that's been made in part or in whole in Turkmenistan. And then, as it's been briefly touched on the ground remedy in the situation of Turkmenistan is currently impossible. And this is why companies need to fully disengage and exit any business relationships involving Turkmen cotton when they encounter it. Again, forced labor import controls are very relevant for the case of Turkmenistan, because by limiting the access of Turkmen cotton goods to international markets, then these measures can play a very important role in increasing the economic pressure on the Turkmen government in order for it to reform the current forced labor system in cotton production. And then very briefly, I did want to touch as well on the existing complementarity between these two instruments, because as I've mentioned, both import bans or MHR-EDD alone are not enough to ensure that there's effective remedy for the tens of thousands of Turkmen citizens who are forced every year by the government to pick cotton, as Farid and Ruslan were previously explaining. And therefore, these two measures must be an integral part of a wider legal framework. And what's more important, they need to complement and reinforce each other. So we, for example, see relevant the use of import controls as appropriate and necessary whenever human rights due diligence efforts on the ground are not impossible, such as here. And then, unless mapping and disclosure is ensured through a company's due diligence process, then the presence of Turkmen cotton within the company's value chain will likely be extremely difficult to identify, making it even harder to enforce import control. So these two instruments need to be designed in a way in which they're powerful in dissuading companies from importing such products, and at the same time, putting pressure on the government that is perpetrating these practices. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm now going to be a bit more specific, and I'm going to be talking about some recommendations on the upcoming legislative piece from the European Union, which is called the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, which is the way in which the European Commission is going to introduce mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence at the EU level. I do want to highlight, though, that the points that I'm going to be making now are also relevant for any government considering passing due diligence legislation. And we have worked on a comprehensive analysis of this legislative proposal, but now I briefly want to touch on some of the key elements that are more relevant for the Turkmen context. So to start with, we have seen that the current proposal has an insufficient scope. which means that given the current thresholds of the proposal, the European Union estimates that there will be 17,000 companies covered by the legislation globally. This is actually a very small number. And the exclusion of small and medium-sized enterprises could be very detrimental to sectors such as fashion, where in the EU in particular, there's 99.8% of textile companies that wouldn't even have to comply with this law because they wouldn't be in scope. So again, in line with the UNGPs, all businesses, regardless of their size, should be mandated to undertake due diligence. Then secondly, we also recommend that these due diligence requirements that we're talking about are not limited to what the EU has now said as established business relationships, because for Turkmenistan, this focus means that raw materials, including cotton, might be completely out of scope for some companies. So if the relationships with those suppliers and sub-suppliers are not what the EU defines as established, then it will be out of the due diligence requirement. Then in third place, the current proposal should focus on strengthening transparency and disclosure requirements, because the current proposal does not create any new obligations for companies. And in the case of Turkmenistan, as we've briefly touched on, it is particularly important that we can see these mapping and transparency, because abuses are happening at the very bottom of the supply chain. And it's a prerequisite that a company maps and understands its value chain when undertaking this due diligence that we're talking about. Then in fourth place, we believe that meaningful stakeholder engagement should be mandatory in all the stages of the due diligence process, not only where relevant, which is what the current proposal says, because in Turkmenistan, where on the ground engagement is not feasible, there are still other ways to get some credible information. So for example, we know that there are limitations of freedom of association and freedom of speech and so on, and some security risk. And this is why we've got Farid and Ruslan working from elsewhere in the world, because they can't do their work in Turkmenistan. But companies can still reach out to them. So companies need to ensure that the views of local stakeholders are meaningfully captured through other credible representatives and also through consultations with other experts. And lastly, very briefly, I wanted to touch on the responsibilities for the financial sector, which are currently very, very limited in the current proposal. So it only includes very large institutions and only makes them undertake due diligence at a pre-contractual stage. But we think that the financial sector has huge potential to exert very positive influence in leading change, right? So in order to do that, this limitation should be removed, and in smaller financial institutions should be included in the scope, and due diligence should be required throughout the entire life of a financial relation. This is when it comes to the EU's corporate sustainable due diligence, as I was mentioning. And then very briefly, I do want to touch as well, next slide please, on what are the key elements that the EU should be thinking of when designing the upcoming proposal for a forced labor instrument that will be banning the entrance of forced labor product into the EU. This is a bit of a newer debate for the EU. We've been working on MHR-EDD for quite some time, but now the EU is moving very fast with this upcoming proposal. So these are some of the key elements that I would highlight that again would be more relevant for the case of Turkmenistan. So we know that because of what we've been discussing today, that the entirety of the cotton industry is tainted with forced labor in Turkmenistan. So we need a system that would allow for a regional scope and that not only focus on targeting certain entities, because targeting specific entities would not work in this context. We need to have the possibility to ban imports of all goods that are made wholly or partially with Turkmen cotton. Then in second place, we We also recommend that the upcoming proposal includes an effective border mechanism, such as the one in the US, that allows for the detention of forced labor goods at the EU borders, because we believe that the alternative, which would be a market-based only mechanism, consisting of removing the goods once these have already entered the market, could potentially be harder to enforce when we apply it to imports from a specific country or region, which is the case with Turkmenistan. And also this mechanism could potentially have very negative financial consequences, affecting not only businesses, but also enforcement authorities. Then in third place, and I've already mentioned this briefly, there needs to be meaningful stakeholder engagement, right? And another key instrument to ensure that of forced labor instruments should be the effective provision of remedy to stakeholders. But we know that the situation in Turkmenistan is quite exceptional, and companies cannot support the direct provision of remedies to workers in this case. Therefore, as an alternative, what we are proposing is that companies which are found to be contributing or benefiting from Turkmen forced labor are then required to engage with representatives of the global Turkmen community to support financial aid to Turkmen refugees, which would include victims of forced labor, and also with human and labor rights organizations that are working from exile, as we have here today in the panel. Then the next point would be on international cooperation, which must have a key role if what we want is to achieve a global impact, because the EU and national member states should liaise with authorities in other jurisdictions, such as the US, Canada, and so on, to share evidence and in order to be able to align procedures. Because in practice, this would mean that countries with existing import control mechanisms could then alert other states and the EU whenever they identify a supplier that is using Turkmen cotton. And then linked to this international cooperation, we would suggest that the EU ensures a global aligned approach, that this would reduce the risk of retained imports from other countries being reshipped to markets that don't have such strong laws in place. And then lastly, we would also recommend the introduction of a public list of forced labor import bans and or withhold release orders to be created, because there should be a clear procedure for worker organizations and civil society organizations to provide updated information and allegations to this list. Then if we move on to the next slide, please. I'll try and be brief here. What I wanted to talk about in this slide is, in practice, what does this mean for companies, right? So it means that we need to design laws that will oblige companies first to fully map their supply chains to the raw material level and exclude any cotton originating in Turkmenistan. And given the fact that the current situation does not allow businesses to affect workers' conditions on the ground. So identifying Turkmen cotton would be key both to comply with companies' due diligence obligations, but also to ensure that they are not importing forced labor tainted goods. Then companies should also be mandated to establish a binding policy that prohibits the use of Turkmen cotton and also prohibits businesses with companies that use Turkmen cotton, meaning that suppliers, sub-suppliers, and other entities should also implement the same policy. Then there needs to be in place a way to verify compliance with the company's policy and ensure, for example, that their purchasing practices, among other elements, do support its implementation. And this also means ceasing relationships with companies that refuse to stop using cotton from Turkmenistan. And then in the next place, we think that companies need to be obliged to publicly release the documentation on the steps that they are taking to ensure that their value chains are free from forced labor. And lastly, meaningful stakeholder engagement, again, which I've already covered, with the Cotton Campaign and Turkmen organizations, for example, to support these advocacy efforts. Then next slide, please. Also, very briefly, we can expand on this in the Q&A, but here are some of the recommendations that the US could potentially implement in order to improve its current import control mechanism. So we would recommend the US to publish the list of detentions made and the value of the shipments that have been detained under withhold release orders against Turkmen cotton. This would contribute to greater transparency and enabling better monitoring as well. And then we would also recommend that the US shares information and proactively engages with civil society organizations and also other entities to enhance global efforts to trace supply chains. And then lastly, we would encourage the enforcement of labor provisions of the US, Canada and Mexico agreement, making sure that those products that are subject to US WROs are not permitted to enter Canada. So this means that there needs to be collaboration between different government entities, such as the Customs and Border Protection in the US, trade representatives, Canada Border Services Agency, and Employment and Social Development Canada, among some others. And then to end, Raluca, if you can go to the next slide. I've mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation how import controls and MHR-EDD need to be part of a wider framework that tackles state-imposed forced labor. So these other measures that would complement the two instruments that I've been talking about would be, for example, the use of trade, diplomatic, and foreign policy measures in order to put pressure on the perpetrating governments to end the use of this system. And this should include the use of sanctions on trade, export, or provision of products or services that are used to support the state-imposed forced labor systems or other human rights abuses. Then in second place, to facilitate the identification and monitoring of the importation of products made from forced labor, it is crucial that there's public access to customs data. And this is why customs data should not be confidential and should not be kept just to government. It should be disclosed publicly. And then lastly, if when a country or region begins to transition away from the use of state-imposed forced labor, as we have seen with Uzbekistan, we should be requiring independent and ongoing monitoring, which includes the support for an enabling environment for civil society and independent trade unions. So I think I'm gonna end my presentation here. Sorry if it's taking me a bit longer. I know there's a lot of information here, so please do feel free to reach out or to ask any questions now in the Q&A session. Thank you, Raluca, and all the other panelists as well.
Thanks, Rocío. This has been a really comprehensive list of recommendations to governments and brands. And thank you for providing that. And also I want to thank you to Anti-Slavery International, right? To you and your colleagues for the work you are doing as part of the cotton campaign to bring forced labor, Turkmen cotton, on the agenda of policymakers and the EU. And before we move forward, I want to take quickly the opportunity to also thank our colleagues at the Human Trafficking Legal Center, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but they have been instrumental in driving our supply chain research and tracing forced labor, Turkmen cotton. So this is the end of our presentation. Here, the last slide lists the links to the materials we used in the presentation and will circulate the PowerPoint so you will have access. And now we're happy to open the Q&A section. You can add your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box of Zoom. Have there been any questions until now? I couldn't check while sharing my screen.
Raluca, there are a couple of questions in the chat, and in particular, I would direct Ruslan and Farid to the first one. And while Ruslan is writing an answer, but Ruslan, why don't you share the answer with everybody on the webinar, and then maybe Farid can take the second one about whether or not there has been an evaluation of cotton farming.
Sure. The question is, how do you know there's still child labor if your monitors are not labor experts and are not able to freely travel across the country? Is everything based on scattered reports from within the country? Thank you for your question, and I was about to post an answer. Well, one doesn't really have to be a labor expert to be able to identify a child among the people boarding buses. Yeah, plus, you know, the places in the report where we talk about that, it's the local resident visiting early in the morning the pickup point and seeing all of that and speaking to the children. You know, those children could be their neighbors, and the person who sent us that information, he knows exactly how old his neighbor is and at what grade he is sitting in school. So, I mean, I don't find this question, I think I answered it.
Ruslan, if I could add something, I have been involved with monitoring forced labor in closed countries in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan for more than 10 years. And there is a well-developed established methodology that Ruslan and his team and Farid and his team use that is quite similar to the methodology used by Uzbek partners to monitor forced labor in Uzbekistan when the country there was much more closed. And that is a methodology where the outside expert, in this case, Ruslan and Farid, with support from other coalition members, design a methodology that is based on firsthand accounts from people on the ground, but is also corroborated through other kinds of sources. You know, Ruslan runs an entire news organization and so is able to corroborate information through multiple sources. And so we are looking really at a systems level. And of course, we learn to understand that system by also supplementing it with the data that is collected by monitors. So the data that we have in the report is from 4 of 5 regions in Turkmenistan. It is based on multiple interviews throughout the regions, including at the rural level, at the farms, at the pickup points where cotton pickers go to the fields, from institutions where we see heads of institutions organizing. In fact, Ruslan has recordings of this, where heads of institutions are ordering their employees to go to the fields at risk of dismissal. And we also understand how the system is organized from the top down at the governmental level. So just to reinforce what Ruslan has said, that this is a systematic methodology, while we would love to do even more monitoring and have greater access, the monitoring that we do have is able to give us, I think, a really clear picture of the system as it exists. And to the point that you make about whether or not in the question about whether or not there's the ability to travel, that also underscores the idea that brands are not in a position to do any real due diligence because of the restrictions on travel, on interviewing people openly without fear of reprisals, et cetera. So to go back, to link it to the points that Rocío made in her presentation, the only way that brands and suppliers can be sure that they're not using tainted forced labor goods from Turkmenistan in their supply chain is to map their supply chain and cut ties with any supplier that is using Turkmen cotton because of that inability to do meaningful due diligence. So I hope that's helpful. Farid, there is a question about whether or not there has been an international or UN evaluation of the cotton farming system in Turkmenistan. Maybe you could answer that one.
As far as I know, such evaluation has not been done. As far as the UN, special rapporteurs from the UN were not able to get to Turkmenistan, even though their position allows them to do it, but it's impossible right now. While I was still there, I know that UN special reporter on minorities was able to get into the country, but he couldn't really do anything or do much because he was followed by the law enforcement and special services everywhere. So anything to do with social or economic rights in Turkmenistan, I think any kind of evaluation, international evaluation is not possible right now, even though, of course, it would be very beneficial. And first of all, for Turkmenistan.
That when Farid is answering in Russian, you do need to select English under the interpretation link on the bottom of the toolbar so that you can hear the interpretation into English.
Thank you. I see there's also a question saying, is China a big importer of Turkmen cotton? We're going to post the link to the report in the chat, also showing the findings of our supply chain research, which revealed that China primarily imports yarn from Turkmenistan. In terms of exerting pressure on the Beijing government, I think other colleagues on this panel are probably better fitted to answer that. I would just say that it's important to go back again to the brands and the brand supply chains and flag that there is a big risk that products they import from China are made with semi-finished goods, in this case, yarn coming from Turkmenistan. So again, we need to make sure that brands are required to fully map their supply chains all the way down to the cotton level tier and understand where all these semi-finished goods come from in the production of their goods. Does anyone want to add anything in particular on engagement with the government of China, especially maybe based on your experience on doing that as it relates to Xinjiang?
Raluca, I can add briefly that we see the primary means for pressuring garment production or textile production in China as through engagement with the brands that are conducting operations in China. And there we have the ability to really put pressure on brands as regards the presence of forced labor goods from Xinjiang or from Uyghur forced labor in their supply chains, and the requirement that they map and disclose their supply chains to be sure that it is free of not only Xinjiang cotton, but other kinds of forced labor goods, which would include Turkmen cotton goods. I think we see that right now as a more productive route than direct engagement with the government of China, which has not shown any particular willingness to engage on these issues. Whereas the examples that I highlighted in my presentation in Europe, we there are doing direct engagement with the governments as well as with brands and other purchasers.
There is a question that maybe Ruslan and Farid you'd like to answer. There's someone, Amina Kurbanova, asking, could you please explore a bit on the ILO role, including its supervisory mechanisms and labor standards in ending the forced labor situation in Turkmenistan?
I think Allison is more in a position to answer it. We discussed it also recently. We know that the ILO is not very active in Turkmenistan in this regard at the moment. And we have been hearing that there were intentions from the Turkmen side to engage deeper with the ILO. We don't know about the status of that idea, of that project yet. Because COVID also changed a few plans, you know. But to my knowledge, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, colleagues, there is minimal engagement between Turkmenistan government and the ILO on this issue.
I can add briefly that we know from engaging with members of the Uzbek government and particularly the Ministry of Labor that there is some interest from the Turkmen side in the Uzbek experience, particularly the Uzbek experience in engaging with the ILO, and we're quite encouraged by that. In terms of the supervisory mechanisms, we do, from our coalition, report on Turkmenistan's compliance with ILO conventions as part of the regular reporting cycle, and hope to get more scrutiny that way.
I also want to add while we're waiting for other questions that, we're happy to organize one-on-one calls with some of you. I know that we have on the call people who are policymakers, who represent enforcement agencies, brands, multi-stakeholder organizations. So please reach out to us if you want to discuss a bit more in detail our recommendations to governments and brands. Ruslan, did you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to add that in the beginning, and actually Allison's presentation led me to this thought about companies, particular in Turkey and Dubai. I want to flag one company. It's called Delanor Group, and I posted that also in the chat if you have seen it. The thing is that, and the risks of working with any Turkmen supplier actually, is that you cannot only contribute to the forced labor system in Turkmenistan, yes, but also there is a risk of enriching family members of Berdimuhamedov, because this particular company, Delanor Group, it is headquartered in Turkey, in Istanbul, but has offices in Dubai. It has office in London, even though we believe it's a virtual office. And last year, with colleagues from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, we established that this particular company that also ships textiles, thread, and raw cotton to world markets. They even boast, they say Spanish market, Turkish market. So this company belongs to one of the nephews of Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov.
I was wondering before we drop off, because we're getting close to the 90 minutes that we booked this webinar for, if Farid or Ruslan, you want to add anything, just because it's such a great opportunity to have you on the call, and we should really take advantage of having you here, who are able to provide firsthand reports of the human and labor rights situation on the ground in Turkmenistan.
There is one final question from John O'Brien. Do you think it's possible the Turkmen government will end these practices within our lifetime? I believe yes, because nobody actually in Uzbekistan expected that the things would so drastically change within no time. If we basically, what is it, 4 or 5 years? I believe it's very little time for such reforms. So there has to be several triggers for those reforms in Turkmenistan. Perhaps complete government change, in addition to continued pressure from the international community, from governments, from brands. And sooner or later, one day or the other, the Turkmen government will be forced to sit with us at a round table and think about a roadmap, to discuss it, to acknowledge the problem, to discuss it and find solutions to solve it. It's just a matter of time. But I'm optimistic in this sense. I believe that in our lifetime, we'll see that happening.
And like Ruslan said, we need to keep the pressure up together and make sure that in all international fora, we get to call for ending state-imposed forced labor in Turkmenistan. For example, we haven't mentioned this in our presentation, but we know that Turkmenistan is looking to become a member of the World Trade Organization. Now, again, it's another opportunity for governments to use trade and trade relations as a promoter of human rights and make sure that you don't encourage Turkmenistan to continue this egregious forced labor system. Sorry, Ruslan, go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm seeing we're getting more questions, yes.
Another question, very interesting, yes. I understand that while forced labor still exists in Turkmenistan and is even widespread, it is in decline. I don't think so. We have evidence, documented evidence. We have audio recordings that show that it's not only the fault of the local corrupt officials. We have evidence that leads us to a thought that this is a chain. It's a from top to down chain. When school teachers have to report to an official who's sitting at the city hall and overseeing the sphere of education and healthcare, for example, he or she, in his or her turn, have to report up to the, to the city hall governor, and the governor then reports to the vice prime minister or minister of agriculture, and then goes all the way from bottom to down. And these orders to send a certain number of people, pick certain amount of cotton, they are not made by local officials, those so-called corrupt officials. Yes, they are corrupt. Yes, there is absolutely no control on how this money collected from the civil servants is being spent. If they in fact hire 100 replacement workers, or they hire just 50 and pocket the money of the rest of the 50 people, we don't know it. They are corrupt, but there's absolutely no doubt that this system is systematic, and it comes from the top leadership of the Turkmen government.
And to add to that, sorry, quickly, because I see the question also says, is there independent evidence? Yes, there is. And that's precisely what Ruslan and Farid's team have been doing. And we shared the report, and we encourage you all to use that in your lobbying and advocacy efforts. Mm-hmm. And Allison, if you want to jump in now quickly before
we need
to close.
I'm happy to have a one-on-one or with anybody that is interested in exploring this more. But I do think it's important that we learn from the experience of ILO engagement in Uzbekistan as we move forward with increasing pressure on Turkmenistan to accept some kind of international presence potentially. And that is not to position the independent work that Ruslan and Farid are doing as somehow lesser or separate from independent monitoring. The ILO is a constituent organization. The Turkmen government is a member of the ILO. We saw in Uzbekistan in the very early days of ILO monitoring that ILO monitors were accompanied by Uzbek officials to the fields. And in those early reports, ILO monitors really didn't have any independent access to pickers that was free from a government presence. And that lasted for several years. And I think we can anticipate in Turkmenistan that they would also be similarly constrained. And so there is a real consistent need to have independent civil society voices provide an additional data point that provides a different and fuller picture to whatever an international monitoring presence can provide. We obviously think there's room for both, and we think that these are complementary. But I do think, again, that there is a lot to learn from the Uzbek experience here as we think about how the ILO might engage going forward. There was also a question that has been asked in the chat and in the Q&A about whether forced labor is a problem in other countries in Central Asia. You've heard a little bit from Raluca about what has happened in Uzbekistan, where the system has gone from systematic state-imposed forced labor to a situation where we can say that state-imposed forced labor has ended. There has been little independent research, as far as I know, on the other Central Asian countries, which do produce smaller amounts of cotton, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. There has been some state-imposed or some state presence, particularly in Tajikistan, but I think we need more information about that.
I'm sorry, unfortunately, we need to wrap up. I can see some people are dropping off as well. Please send us questions. You can contact us at coordinator@cottoncampaign.org. I'll put it in the chat and it will be circulated together with the presentation. Before we close, I just want to quickly thank our panelists and also our colleague, Caitlin Hoover at GLJ-ILRF, who helped us organize the webinar. And thank you once again for participating, and we'll circulate this recording and the PowerPoint presentation soon. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.